Anyway, let's go now to Hong Kong, to this interview I did earlier this week with Joshua Wong, who started with the umbrella protest back in 2014 when he was, I believe, 17 years of age. He's now 21, and he's one of the leading democracy advocates in Hong Kong.
I'm Joshua Wong from Hong Kong, activist and politician, fight for democracy under the threat of China. And last year has just been jailed for around 100 days.
What were you in prison for?
I am in prison because I organized and led the umbrella movement 4 years ago. The massive civil disobedience in Hong Kong asked for a direct election.
Now, how many people were involved in the umbrella movement?
During umbrella movement, more than 200,000 people come to the street on the same time and block the road and led Beijing to aware that Hong Kong people need Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong, and also one person, one vote to choose the leader of our city.
How come it took so long after the umbrella protests for you to be jailed?
Under legal procedure of Hong Kong, we just recognize it as a sugarcoat rule of law, which means that under the Hong Kong political prosecution, activists might be continued to face trial and delaying being locked up in prison.
What was it like in prison, and where were you in prison?
I was locked up in the jail for young adult, which means above 18 but less than 21. And when I was locked up in the prison in Kowloon, how those staff of the prison just verbally assaulted activists is the things that I experienced.
It would be interesting to know what kind of prisoners you've got and what is the daily regime in Hong Kong.
Marching exercise, I need to participate every day. And I heard a lot of inmates have been physically assaulted by prison staff, especially on how those prison staff treat prisoners without dignity. That's what I have faced. And what I remember is when they need to do the cross-examination, they just force me to take off all of my clothes, even include my underwear. So what I mean is when I was in prison, during the cross-examination by the prison staff, I was not allowed to wear any clothes or any pants or even underwear.
So this sounds like a kind of psychological attempt to make you feel vulnerable.
Yeah, that's what I experienced.
What exactly was your so-called crime?
Participating in unauthorized assembly and have been locked up in prison for 6 months. Yeah.
So would you explain, please, what is the status of Hong Kong? We don't see, for example, Chinese troops on the streets of Hong Kong, do we?
That's have happened already. What I mean is the sovereignty of Hong Kong have transferred from UK to China in 1997 and originally referred to the international treaty, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which promised to let Hong Kong to have one country, two system, which means under the same country, China, but have a separate system compared to mainland China. But I would describe now the one country, two system already turned to be one country, one and a half system. And no matter freedom of association, freedom of speech, or freedom of press, all are under the suppression of China and under the threat of Beijing.
Can you tell us, for example, what newspapers restrictions are? Because, for example, South China Morning Post still publishes, is quite critical of China, isn't it?
South China Morning Post is not critical to China since it transferred and owned by Jack Ma. And it might be the one who try to stand more moderate on the pro-Beijing side. 80% or most of the newspaper in Hong Kong are owned by red capital or tycoons that serve for the interests of Beijing. That's why I would say that when the Foreign Correspondent Club, FCC, would like to invite the activists that advocate for Hong Kong independence to just give a speech in a lunch meeting. And what we are aware is the former chief executive of Hong Kong just issued a statement and to urge FCC not to make any invitation on that activists that advocates on Hong Kong independence. That's why what we are aware is freedom of speech and freedom of press, of course, compared to mainland China and some of this country in Southeast Asia, we are far more better than that. But it doesn't mean that we are not under threat.
Now, at that Foreign Correspondents Club meeting a couple of weeks ago, there was actually a big protest outside by pro-Chinese people from Hong Kong who don't agree with you. They think, and many would agree with them, that actually now as part of China, it's not appropriate to be talking about Hong Kong independence.
I'm not the one who asked for Hong Kong independence. I just believe that the system of Hong Kong should be protected and to let Hong Kong people to choose the leader of their city. I'm not an activist advocate on Hong Kong independence, but it doesn't mean that the Foreign Correspondent Club can't invite anyone advocate on Hong Kong independence to give a speech. If we believe in freedom of speech, so what's wrong for journalists? Just invite them to the private club to give a sharing. But what we are aware is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China government just delivered a statement and warned FCC not to invite that activist, which means that the internal operation of FCC is just under the interference of Beijing government, referred to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
But for hundreds of years, the rulers of Hong Kong have been appointed by the British. So really, you can't say that the ruler of Hong Kong should be appointed by people from Hong Kong.
I'm not saying that we need to have the appointed procedure, but as we believe in democratization and democracy, instead of just let the small circle pro-Beijing elite to pick or screen the leader of this city. So what's wrong to let the citizen, the voters, not only electing the legislator inside the legislative council, but also elected the leader of our city representing the administration. That's what we hope for. And also democratization, which we recognize as universal suffrage, is the promise of Beijing government towards Hong Kong since and before the handover.
What about the freedom of worship and freedom of religions in Hong Kong?
Hong Kong still have certain degree of religious freedom, but self-censorship become more common in the recent year. As we know that no matter which religions, if they have any branch or organization based in Hong Kong, they might have certain connection with the organization in mainland China. Just like the Christian school, they will try to preach the gospel in mainland China. But there's a warning sign given by the government. If those church or for those religious people, they care or talk more about politics, or have tried to speak for social justice, they might not be allowed to enter mainland China to preach the gospel. That's why self-censorship become more common in the recent year.
Well, that's interesting you talk about social justice, because this is the heart of many religions, is that they don't like the idea of people becoming super rich, whereas the Chinese government and also, of course, Western governments do.
Yeah, but in Hong Kong, it seems more and more leaders of different religions, because they need to maintain the good relations with China government official, which means guanxi, that we pronounce in Mandarin. It results for those religious leaders, they might just enter the upper class circle and not talk about social justice, but just talk about how can at the same time worship God, but also embrace President Xi. That's the tactics for them to enter mainland China to spread their religious ideology.
What about the pronouncement last year from President Xi that anyone who disrespects the national anthem, disrespects the flag, criticises him, can end up with 3 years in prison? Is that in force in Hong Kong right now? Because, of course, that would mean there is no real freedom of speech. If you can't criticise your leaders, then this is a grave human rights problem.
The law absolutely have been implemented in mainland China already, but in Hong Kong, the legislation process will start on October, which means that for the national anthem law, it will have the discussion and debate in the Legislative Council of Hong Kong, but once, as we know that the Legislative Council is just dominated by pro-Beijing camp, what we are afraid is no matter brainwashing, education, or self-censorship, or just how violate on freedom of mind and also critical thinking, it will become more common and common.
What is the Legislative Council? Because even though they're running Hong Kong now, they're not really democratic, are they?
In Hong Kong, Legislative Council, half of the seats are directly elected, but half of the seats are owned by the pro-Beijing camp and just serve for the interests of tycoons or China government. What I mean is, since election exists in Hong Kong 3 decades ago till now, in every election, pro-democracy camp versus pro-China camp, pro-democracy camp always get the majority every time. We win in the election to get more than 60% of votes. But under current semi-democratic system, finally, democratic camp become the minority inside the Legislative Council. That's why we have asked for long time and to urge the government to implement full and direct election in Legislative Council. But Beijing just continue to ignore the request and just hope to remain the current election system in Hong Kong.
There are also the representatives, I'm not sure what you call them, is it MPs or something, in Hong Kong?
In Hong Kong, we have legislator, or we call them lawmaker. Half of them are come from different district, different constituency. But for others, come from the functional constituency, from maybe business sector, financial sector, or others. And of course, due to the closer ties of the business market between Hong Kong and China, finally, under the red capital domination, absolutely for those representatives of the functional constituency, when they work inside the Legislative Council, of course, they are the one who belongs to the pro-Beijing camp.
Okay, so am I right? Because I think that some legislators have been elected by the people in Hong Kong and then told that they cannot take their seat. In fact, they have been told to leave.
Yeah, that's what my organization, my political party experienced. What I mean is now in Hong Kong, apart from activists being locked up in prison, we also face lawmakers being kicked out from the office just because of their political stand. Last year, including Nathan Law, one of the umbrella movement student leader and also the youngest ever lawmaker in Hong Kong history, elected at the age of 23, just being kicked out of office under Beijing interpretation on Hong Kong Constitution.
Why?
What I mean is, according to the background of disqualification of legislative incident, Beijing, they just claim that the one who do not take the oath sincere enough might not be qualified. But from the point of view of pro-democratic camp, Beijing government just have to kick the one that they don't like and kick them out of office and cause them to lose the seat.
Now, doesn't that really have echoes across Hong Kong where people are thinking, well, what's the point of me voting if the person I vote for, if Beijing don't like them, then they just remove them?
Yeah, that's why what we experience is since the disqualification of legislator, and the next is activists being locked up in prison. And last August, Hong Kong have more than 100,000 people come to the street again to join the protest, join the rally, and to urge Beijing government stop to suppress on Hong Kong freedom.
You talked about a demonstration recently with 100,000 people on the streets. That's a lot of people.
Last August, yeah.
Yeah. What motivates these people? What were they fighting for on that occasion?
People come to the street, of course, is because of democracy, freedom, and etc. But last August, when more than 20 activists in Hong Kong have been locked up in prison, they just hope to let Beijing and Hong Kong government aware that we disagree on political prosecution. And lock activists in prison is not a way to solve the problem in Hong Kong.
Do you have political prisoners now?
Yeah, in Hong Kong, more than 50 activists are in prison. One point I would like to add, I still have court case need to face. And they scheduled the trial day on next year, April, which means I still have chance to serve jail sentence again.
And what is it for this time?
Also umbrella movement.
Do you feel like you are fighting against the tide, Joshua, because you're fighting Beijing? It's one of the most powerful political forces on the planet, and really it's a very tiny country, Hong Kong, and many people in China point to you and say, well, really, you're just like a Trojan horse for the West, for America, for the British.
I would say that Hong Kong, no doubt, is a small and tiny city, but with the special position and the uniqueness, we deserve people around the world to care more about Hong Kong and how the people in Hong Kong, it seems to be just a financial center. But after the umbrella movement, I believe more people are aware that Hong Kong is also a place with people that they deserve democracy and they deserve human rights. That's what I believe. That's why I think when under the trade war and under the China model being more attractive in the recent year, I believe it's time for people to look towards Hong Kong, the city, stand on the forefront to react on the rising of China.
Some people say the umbrella movement, and maybe even your own party, is really funded by the American, the British, the CIA. What do you say to that?
According to the pro-Beijing newspaper, they claim that I am not only funded by CIA, I'm even trained by CIA and trained by U.S. Marine. Yeah, it's some of the propaganda by the pro-Beijing camp, and I will say that is not true at all, and we will not receive any donation from foreigners. We just receive donation by Hong Kong people. And I think refer to this kind of rumors of I being trained by CIA, I would say that compare my body size with Tom Cruise, I believe even the pro-Beijing camp do not believe that I have been trained by CIA agent or U.S. Marine.
Now, lots of people are concerned about China. That's true, because it's not a democratic country. And also we're seeing some extension of the powers of surveillance, this kind of thing. Something called a rage helmet that you have to wear at work, where if you're starting to feel upset, then your boss can detect through your hat that you're feeling upset and may sack you. Also, an enormous amount of surveillance going on in the west of China. In fact, even overtaking London, having more surveillance cameras than London, which is quite exceptional. What is the state surveillance system like in China? Because I know it's not so much in Hong Kong, and I wonder, is it also coming to Hong Kong?
State surveillance system have not been fully implemented in Hong Kong, but absolutely it is already being implemented for a certain month or certain year in mainland China. But it already showed the differences of Hong Kong and mainland China. And Hong Kong, I would say that even the surveillance system do not fully implement. We still strongly worry and concerned about how the agents from China, they might be based in Hong Kong. And in previous day, refer to the Causeway Bay book publisher incident, book publisher in Hong Kong, just because of publishing book that seems to be a bit sensitive on President Xi and just face the result of being physically kidnapped from Hong Kong to mainland China. That's why even in Hong Kong, we have not yet fully implemented the surveillance system. It's still hard for us to ensure our personal safety once we are the one who advocate for freedom of press, freedom of publishing, and freedom of association.
Last week, the United Nations talked about 1 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang, I think, the Western province, being taken to re-education camps. The United Nations are certainly getting concerned.
Why do people need to be re-educated? It because under the propaganda and narrative of Beijing, it just allow everyone live in China to follow the order and loyal to the communist regime. That what we worry and the things that we don't want to be implemented in Hong Kong. And according to what United Nations, they show the concern, I believe no matter Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, or other city or places that is in the coastal area of mainland China, I believe we need to have more solidarity and let the world aware that under the rising and expanding influence of Beijing government, they need to take the closer eyes on what is happening in this failed city.
Joshua Wong, anyway, Martin, you had a few things to say about the Uyghurs and Xinjiang province, didn't you?
Yeah, well, I mean, we mentioned it the other week, or you mentioned it. In actual fact, what I've discovered this week, the UN has not, in fact, claimed that the 1 million people are being held in re-education camps. It was just a UN meeting, which is not part of the main structure of the UN, a US person who was actually linked to very extreme anti-Chinese views in the US, claimed that 1 million people were being held. Now, I listened, very, very interesting, very intelligent young fella there. But of course, he doesn't necessarily know what the CIA gets up to. And the CIA are determined to try and bring down the Chinese regime if they can. Trump is determined to try and bring them down, and they're not wrong to be paranoid about it. On the other hand, of course, they'd be much better off letting people like him have their say and trying to find some kind of compromise with them.
Okay. Let's go back to listen to Joshua now. Now, you talk about, and many people talk about, the Chinese Communist Party, the communist system in China, but actually, for many people, they look at it as more of a capitalist system. It seems to have been more successful in capitalism than the United States, where China are holding much of the American debt. Does it really make any sense to still talk about Beijing as a communist?
It depends on you choose to understand or analyze Beijing on which political perspective. Of course, it is still the one who strongly advocates on communism, on words, by slogan or by propaganda. But if we need to review on the economic system, absolutely, they implement a state capitalist system that to try to expanding the influence, and especially in the trade war, you see how the tension between US and China. So I would say that the China model is a mix with the propaganda of communism and nationalism. But in fact, from the economic perspective, it's just enhancing state capitalism.
When we saw the talk at the Foreign Correspondents Club a couple of weeks ago by the Hong Kong independence movement, at the same time, the Chinese Navy was doing some of the biggest exercises it's ever done, quite close to Hong Kong. But Beijing said that this was only in response to the United States also doing big exercises with their Navy.
Refer to the Navy exercise of both US or China generate more people fear on national security program. That's the agenda to push forward the Article 23, the national security law, to be implemented in Hong Kong. That's the agenda.
What made you decide to take this course? Because it does seem to me, Joshua, it's almost like a David versus Goliath exercise you're embarking on here.
It's not only David versus Goliath. It's David versus 10 or 100 or more than thousands of Goliath in the recent year under disqualification of legislator, being locked up in prison, and also face the kidnapped incident in Hong Kong. That's what we're afraid and fear on. But what motivates me, I would say that I remember the new words, the new vocab chosen by Oxford Dictionary last year, youthquake. I believe youth in the world, no matter they live in which city or country, they can make change and let the world to aware that what is meant by universal value, just like democracy and freedom. I would say that as the one who born and live and love Hong Kong, what I hope is to be the master of my own house instead of allowing others to dominating my future. I hope Hong Kong new generation can really be the one determine our own destiny instead of allowing Communist Party or Beijing government to control our future. That's why we hope one day we can through our vote to choose the leader of our city.
But President Xi, he would say Joshua Wong, he's unpatriotic. He's a traitor to China.
I would say that under Beijing propaganda, absolutely, I'm not patriot enough to love the country. But absolutely, it's hard for us to love the regime, but we can through our action to show our love to people in this city. That's what I try to do. And I believe that Hong Kong, according to the Sino-British Joint Declaration, we deserve one country, two systems for 50 years. So when 50 years end, I'm not sure what will happen. But from 1997, the year of Hanover, to 2047, it might be the end of 50 years unchanged policy. I believe around 2047 is still the day that my generation can be the master of our own house, and we can still recognize ourselves as Hong Kongers.
Well, that's pro-democracy leader Joshua Wong from Hong Kong there. Pretty impressive managing to get 250,000 people out onto the streets and to spend the night for days on end out in the street blocking the traffic. Really just simply over. Martin, the main thing this was all over was whether or not the Hong Kong people were going to be able to decide their own fate. But China is saying no. The most recent news from Hong Kong is that the 5 Occupy protesters, this is from 2014, the wheels of justice turned very, very slowly in Hong Kong, quite clearly, even slower than here, have just been found guilty of contempt of court in a trial earlier disrupted by a photo-taking incident involving a mainland Chinese woman. I'll put a link up to that on our show page, and also put the full interview with Joshua Wong on our podcast at thisweek.org.uk. Time to sign off for the Murdoch News at 8. This show's podcast, story links and comment page and our contact details at thisweek, one word, .org.uk. I'm on Twitter at Tony Gosling. Have a relaxing and enjoyable BCFM weekend. Do please join us for the Politics Show at 6 o'clock next week. God bless, and don't let the banksters get you down.
Winning community radio station for Bristol, bringing you national news on the hour. Live from the Sky News Centre.